Good day everyone, I am Victor, the moderator for this webinar. I welcome everyone for today's webinar, which is Summarizing and Analyzing Data with Excel Pivot Tables. I would now like to introduce our presenter for today, Kathy Hotsworth. Kathy has over 30 years of experience in classroom and virtual training and has been an instructor of Microsoft Office since 1989. I would now like to hand over the floor to the speaker. Over to you, Kathy.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Kathy Horowitz, and today's topic is on using Excel pivot tables to help us summarize and analyze our data. And we'll cover the following features. We'll talk about, first of all, what pivot tables are, and then we'll create some pivot tables, modify their structure. We'll learn how to sort and filter the data in a pivot table. We'll work with the calculations in a pivot table. We'll also show the pivot table data in terms of percentages rather than values. Most importantly, we'll talk about refreshing the pivot table based on changes to the original database. We'll group date fields together to look at data over a variety of time periods, and we'll drill down to the source of the data. In terms of filtering, we'll learn about slicers, which is a very visual way to filter a pivot table. And finally, we'll do some formatting to our pivot table. So let's talk about what a pivot table actually is. First of all, a pivot table is a table, and they're used to summarize and analyze large amounts of data. The data that we'll be working with today represents a travel agency. There are a few rules for your database. Starting with Excel 2013 and above, a recommended pivot table looks at our data, and based on where there is text, where there are numbers, what's in the first column, row headers, and what's in the last column, typically a calculation, our first pivot table. So in our example, yes, we want the destinations as a row heading, but we want the sales offices as a column heading. Where it says row labels, there's a drop-down arrow in the corner. If I click the filter drop-down arrow, it's a conventional filter. You can have as many fields in that filter area as you want. Now, you might have noticed that those filters were a little bit different than our conventional filters. A conventional filter contains checkboxes so that I can select more than one in any combination. The filter area filters don't have checkboxes, which means by default I can only select one at a time. So we can do what's called a pivot table drill down. It kind of reverses the process. And I'm going to double click on that grand total of 26 tickets sold. And it creates a new worksheet. So know that the sheet does not update. Pivot tables are dynamic. We can pivot the data around. We can sort a pivot table. We can filter a pivot table. And we talked about using the filter part of the pivot table areas. And now we're going to talk about formatting a pivot table and actually changing the pivot table's calculation. How we format a pivot table is a little bit different than how we format regular data in a worksheet because the pivot table can be rearranged. If I select all the cells in the pivot table and format them, what happens if later on the pivot table gets rearranged? And if the pivot table gets rearranged, the format stays with the numbers, not with the cells. In your booklet, I've talked about all the different calculations and what they mean. But the data can also be represented as percentages. And the percentages can be based on a lot of different things. And I've got all those listed in your booklet as well. We're going to talk about how data refreshes in a pivot table. And this is one of the most important things that I can teach you today. The truth is that if my data in my raw table changes, so if any of my values change, which would change my total sales, does the pivot table update? And the answer is that by default, it does not. If you add new data to the bottom of your database, it is not included even if you refresh a pivot table, which means as I add rows to the bottom of the table, they automatically become part of the table, the pivot table, when it's refreshed. Now let's talk a little bit about grouping data, specifically grouping dates and times. Here's adding records to a data source. Next, we're going to talk about using slicers. A slicer is a tool that we use for filtering. And let's spend our last couple of minutes doing some formatting to our pivot table. There's a whole gallery of colors. If you click on the More button and open it up, they go from light, and the farther down you scroll, the more colorful they get. So last thing, we can add what are called blank rows. If you click fourth button from the left, blank rows, I can add a blank line after each item. So using the Design tab, we can format a pivot table in a way that it's easier to analyze. Well, we've made it through our pivot tables seminar. We've talked about why pivot tables are truly a great way to summarize and analyze data. It makes the data more easily understood, not just for ourselves, but for others. We can find patterns in the data, and then we can format those pivot tables to make the viewing of the data easier. I hope you learned a lot today about pivot tables. I thank you all very much for attending. My name is Kathy Horwitz, and I hope to see you in future webinars. I appreciate your time and I appreciate your attention. I wish you a very nice rest of your day. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Kathy. That does conclude the session for today. Thank you everyone for participating. You may all disconnect now. Have a great day ahead. Take care.